When World War II broke out, one of the great ironies of the war is that the United States unwittingly played a role in China's conversion to communism. For 20 years, two men dueled for the future of China. Mao Zedong led a battle-hardened band of guerrillas fighting to create a communist China. China's nationalist army was led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who... By 1936, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China had been raging for nearly 10 years.
Mao and Chiang Kai-shek clearly had a visceral hatred for each other. It was often forgotten, and Mao never publicly discussed it very much, but his second wife, I believe it was killed by Chiang's troops in 1927. Chiang also saw the communists as the single greatest threat to his vision of a united China under his rule. And I think over time, Mao and Chiang did see each other as symbols of what the other hated most and resented most.
The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 might well be considered the first act of the Second World War. 8 years before war broke out in Europe, weakened by civil war, China was ripe for invasion by Japan. Many Chinese felt there was only one hope, a united front. If the battling armies of Mao's communists and Chiang's nationalists could fight as one, they might repel the invasion. The only difficulty was that Chiang Kai-shek believed the internal threat to China from Mao was a greater problem than the outside threat from Japan. Well, Chiang was a Manchurian. He wanted revenge on the Japanese invader, and it was clear he was not going to get it from Chiang. He had to force Chiang's hand. The young marshal placed Chiang under house arrest and sent word to Mao. His enemy was now detained. Hurried conferences of communist leaders debated whether to jail Chiang, exile him, or execute him. But Mao Zedong agreed with the young marshal. The real threat to China was not the long civil war, but the invading Japanese. Changing 10 years of communist policy, Mao then offered to join hands with his mortal enemy. The offer to Chiang Kai-shek was simple: renounce his attempts to destroy the communists and agree to combine forces as allies against their joint enemy, Japan. In truth, Chiang had little choice in the matter. Chiang Kai-shek returned to his capital in Nanking, proclaiming the deal a triumph rather than a humiliating defeat. The war for the future of China was put on hold for the time being. Japanese turned their sights on Shanghai. Then, as now, it was the financial heart of China.
The Great Battle of Shanghai was fought between August 13th, 1937, and it ended November 25th. It was a horrible battle. In that period of really only about 3 months, the nationalists lost about 300,000 men.
From Shanghai, the invaders rapidly made their way to the capital. Japanese troops began a rampage of atrocities that has come to be known as the Rape of Nanking. In a 3-month period, the Japanese army killed over 200,000 civilians, raped an estimated 20,000 women, and then burned the city. By the end of 1937, Japan considered China a conquered nation. But in the rural West, Chiang Kai-shek still proclaimed himself Generalissimo of Free China. And in the mountainous Northwest, Mao Zedong's communist stronghold remained unconquered. Yunnan was quite a contrast from the debauched pleasures of Shanghai. Mao and his followers lived in caves dug out of sandstone mountains. His soldiers were mostly peasants. They followed a Spartan egalitarian regimen, a peasant lifestyle for a peasant regime. Mao's guerrillas attacked Japanese railroad tracks, disrupted troop movements, blew up arms caches and ammunition dumps, then disappeared into the surrounding villages. When Chinese peasants were conscripted by force into the Japanese occupation army, Mao's guerrillas did a brisk business buying their Japanese-supplied guns and ammunition. To the peasants of the northern provinces, Mao's guerrillas were truly the Robin Hoods of China. The situation in China was about to change. The Japanese, unable to wipe out the resistance in China, turned their sights on the Pacific. A new player was about to enter the already confused field of wartime China. And Mao Zedong was about to acquire his strangest ally. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. But Pearl Harbor had immense ramifications for China as well. China had now become America's partner in the war. Despite China's united front with Mao's communists, the United States only recognized the government of Chiang Kai-shek. The Americans began a massive campaign to support Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, not only with troops, but with money, equipment, and arms as well.
The Americans rapidly concluded that every Japanese soldier tied down fighting in China was a Japanese soldier who wouldn't be fighting in the Philippines or Hawaii or in San Diego. So the American priority was keeping China in the war. Everyone recognized its efficiency was low, its success rate minimal, but as long as China stayed in the war, it tied down Japan.
While many Americans felt the real war was in Europe, Lieutenant Commander Miles saw China as the ideal place for his military career.
Miles saw this, like many other people, as his stake. That if he could develop a relationship with Dai Li and Chiang Kai-shek, it would be a personal fiefdom for himself, as well as give the U.S. Navy operational opportunities in China.
Dai Li and the Chinese nationalists had their own ulterior motives in the exchange.
Chinese nationalist leadership, especially Jiang and Dai Li, saw Naval Group China as a sort of backdoor to Washington, a way to curry influence, a way to get supplies, and a way to run around groups they didn't like.
But soon another group of spies would enter the picture. General William Wild Bill Donovan had just created the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, a forerunner of the CIA. Its creation in 1941 was controversial. U.S. Army and Navy intelligence resented yet another spy agency meddling in military matters, especially with a civilian at the helm. Miles, now a captain, saw Donovan as encroaching on his turf. Donovan, for his part, chafed under the command of Miles and naval intelligence. Donovan looked for an alliance that would give his spies free rein. He soon turned his eyes northward to the other center of Japanese resistance, Mao's Communists. Mao's troops had already built a reputation as fearless guerrillas. Little was known about Mao's intelligence operations, but they were rumored to be reliable. The fact that the Communists were isolated geographically and militarily was not lost on William Donovan, who saw an opportunity for real independence. In December 1943, Donovan sent a discreet message to Mao in his headquarters in Yan'an, signaling that he might want to meet. Donovan sent word to Mao of a possible alliance. Mao was intrigued. Overt American aid was possibly his best chance at gaining legitimacy and support. He sent word back. The Chinese Communist Party would be quite happy to become America's ally. Under Donovan's direction, a unique team of American spies and diplomats quietly prepared to travel north to meet Mao Zedong. It was 1944, and in China the Allies were not finding the support they so desperately needed. Despite millions of dollars and thousands of tons of arms and ammunition, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces were unable to make any headway against the Japanese. American General Albert Wiedemeyer, head of the Army's headquarters in China, could only express disgust at the military state of America's supposed ally. He said, "China's army is ready for a general hospital rather than a general reserve. The disorganization and muddled planning of the Chinese is beyond comprehension." Part of the problem was that Chiang Kai-shek refused to use all his new Allied resources against the Japanese, preferring instead to save his best troops and equipment to fight against Mao once the war with Japan was over. In the nationalists' eyes, the real war was still against the communists.
In 1943 and early 1944, the military situation in China was so bleak, with the Chinese nationalist armies failing to fight effectively, squandering aid, squirreling it away for an expected civil war, that Roosevelt became intrigued by the advice of some embassy staffers that there was more than one horse to back in China. There was another horse, and that horse might be the Chinese Communist movement. With a little aid, with a little encouragement, they could be induced to fight the Japanese more effectively.
William Donovan, head of the OSS, had come to the same conclusion. He began to put together a secret task force. Its goals were to coordinate guerrilla missions, investigate the communist operations, train Chinese operatives, and relay all significant information back to Washington. Calling itself the Dixie Mission, the group began to make its way to Yan'an, Mao's communist stronghold in northwest China. The Dixie Mission consisted of 24 men. Some were OSS trainers and staff. The rest were members of the U.S. Foreign Service. Diplomats, not soldiers, most of them young, many of them fluent in Chinese. Their arrival in Yan'an was captured in this once top-secret OSS film. It was a diplomatic victory for the communists.
Mao was very receptive to the Dixie Mission. He gave them the nicest caves in Yan'an. People lived in caves carved out of sandstone. He invited them to dances. In fact, the half dozen or so American political officers in the Dixie Mission probably spent more time with Mao and his close aides than any other foreigners did in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s.
Colonel David Barrett arrived with the Dixie Mission in June 1944. He found a hardened group of guerrillas who were adept at conducting operations behind enemy lines. Soon, shipments of weapons and explosives once meant for the nationalists were rerouted to the communists in Yan'an. The communists found the OSS equally useful.
What the Chinese communists wanted from the OSS were three things: cash, with which to bribe the puppets for weapons. Secondly, the communists wanted arms, equipment. And thirdly, I think it's most importantly, that the Chinese communists wanted from the OSS an open military and intelligence cooperation. The openness of that would signal the American acquiescence of the political legitimacy of Chinese Communist government.
The leading member of the mission's diplomatic corps was John Service, who saw in Yunnan the future of free China.
Jack Service, as he was known to his friends, had been born in China. He was a missionary kid. He became convinced during the Dixie Mission that the communists were China's best hope,
suggesting that a change in support from the corrupt nationalists to the hard-fighting communists might help the war effort. William Donovan agreed, sending his top agents from Yugoslavia to the communist stronghold in Yunnan. William Donovan began working with Mao's brilliant General Chu Dai on a daring plan designed to tip the entire balance of the war. A Normandy-style invasion of Japanese-occupied China on the beaches of Shandong province.
Shandong Peninsula was under the Japanese occupation, but the Chinese communists had several guerrilla bases there. And this would draw tremendous American troops and arms inflow with the Chinese communists.
At this point, the Dixie Mission was given a startling proposition. Mao Zedong and his second-in-command, Zhou Enlai, offered to go to Washington.
Mao asked the Dixie Mission to forward a message to President Roosevelt that he and Zhou Enlai would be willing to come either as private citizens or as Chinese representatives. They would go with or without publicity. They would fly to Washington and hope to meet President Roosevelt and make a pitch.
In November 1944, John Service composed a communique for the Dixie Mission, sent by coded telegram to Washington, D.C. It read, "The fact of our assistance to the communists would have profound and desirable political effects in China. There is no question that such a policy would be greatly welcomed by the vast majority of the Chinese people, and that it would raise American prestige. By such policy, which we consider realistically accepts the facts in China, we could expect to hold the communists to our side rather than throw them into the arms of Russia." Mao Zedong prepared for an historic meeting with the American president. A proposed plan to invade the Chinese mainland was intended to cut off supply lines to the Japanese and take some pressure off the brutal island-by-island campaign. China and Mao's guerrillas would provide a critical launching pad for a final assault on the Japanese home islands. Mao Zedong prepared to fly to Washington to present this concept to President Roosevelt. Members of the Dixie Mission felt an alliance with the communists would have historic implications in Asia for the rest of the century. The mission sent a top-secret telegram to Washington urging a profound shift in America's support. It read, "We must not indefinitely underwrite a politically bankrupt regime. We must make a determined effort to capture politically the Chinese communists, rather than allow them to go by default wholly to the Russians. If Chiang and the communists are irreconcilable, then we shall have to decide which faction we're going to support. We must keep in mind this basic consideration. Power in China is on the verge of shifting from Chiang to the communists." But the American efforts for a communist-supported invasion were soon sabotaged. Not by the Japanese, but by Dai Li's nationalist spies. Naval intelligence under Milton Miles saw Donovan's plan for a Chinese land invasion as another attempt to encroach on his turf. Miles and Dai Li agreed that their enemy was not just the Japanese, but the OSS and the Dixie Mission.
Anytime members of the Dixie Mission made proposals, tried to forward ideas advanced by Mao and Zhou for cooperative activities, the naval group people would not only forward to Washington these reports, but almost certainly were a back channel that forwarded these messages to Chiang Kai-shek and Dai Li. Chiang Kai-shek and Dai Li learned about it, and even before Roosevelt received the message, had sent a strong protest denouncing this proposal, ensuring its rejection by authorities in Washington.
Yet another opponent of the plan was the new ambassador to China, Patrick Hurley.
Patrick Hurley was one of the more ominous and ridiculous figures in American diplomatic history. He had been a Republican politician from Oklahoma. Hurley was looking for a foreign assignment. China was as far away from Washington as you could find, and Roosevelt, eager to, in a sense, rid himself of Hurley to a degree, while giving him a prestigious post, dispatched him as a representative to China.
Hurley had a passionate dislike of communism in any form. Chiang Kai-shek and Dai Li wined and dined their potential new ally, dazzling him with displays of the crack troops and new arms they had deliberately kept out of the war. Hurley became convinced that his new friend Chiang Kai-shek was China's only hope.
In the spring of 1945, one of the few remaining critics in the U.S. Embassy, a junior Foreign Service officer, wrote a memo mildly critical of Chinese nationalist policy. Patrick J. Hurley, the ambassador, called him into his office, had him sit in front of the desk. Hurley opened the desk drawer, pulled out a gun, put it in his face and said, "Change that report, or I'm going to shoot you." The man promptly changed the report, not surprisingly.
Patrick Hurley learned about the planned invasion of China from Dai Li's spies. He publicly denounced John's service and the Dixie mission, saying their support for Mao and the Communists, even in wartime, was tantamount to treason. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek protested the American support of Mao, even going so far as to threaten to make a separate peace with Japan. Under this kind of pressure, all official support for the invasion plan was dropped. Mao's trip to Washington was abandoned, and the members of the Dixie mission were sent home in disgrace. Mao Zedong was no longer America's ally. But in the mountains of northwest China, Mao Zedong knew that his war was far from over. The Civil War, placed on hold while China fought Japan, was about to be renewed. Mao's spies informed him that American guns and tanks were again being sent to Chiang Kai-shek's capital, and American planes were flying nationalist troops to strategic points throughout China. Mao's would-be American allies had turned against him. One of the last reporters in Yunnan found Mao to be surprisingly calm about this new and potentially devastating development. Mao confidently told the reporter, "If I can fight Japan with these few rusty rifles, I can fight America too." Billions of dollars in U.S. aid were sent to Chiang Kai-shek. Yet the nationalist forces collapsed before Mao's armies. Corruption and fraud had bankrupted the entire country. Many of Chiang's best troops defected to join the Communists. Chiang Kai-shek fled mainland China in 1949 to join the final remnant of his army on the island of Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the birth of the People's Republic of China. It was a China that was now violently anti-Western and anti-American. Within a year, Mao's soldiers would be shooting at American soldiers on the Korean Peninsula. In the aftermath of the communist victory, many Americans asked who lost China.
In 1949, the Republicans in opposition raised the charge, who lost China? They had their answer. It was Harry Truman, George Marshall, Dean Acheson, lily-livered Democrats who coddled communists. That seemed all the explanation that was necessary. Other Americans pointed out China was never ours to lose. I don't think anyone lost China. I think the Chinese had to find their own way. But I think the whole notion that anyone or any American group lost China is the height of arrogance, as if the most populous country in the world was a puppet on our string.
Nobody lost China. The Communists won a victory, the nationalists lost the war, and that dispute remains unresolved to this day.
Chiang Kai-shek led the nationalist government in Taiwan until his death in 1975, insisting to the end that he alone was the rightful leader of China. Mao Zedong led the People's Republic from 1949 to his death in 1976. In 1972, Mao officially welcomed Richard Nixon to China, re-establishing ties with the West for the first time since the communist nation's founding. 3 decades after his first attempt, Mao Zedong finally met the American president. The Chinese Civil War is still not over. Missiles and threats continue to fly over the Strait of Taiwan more than half a century after the beginning of Mao and Chiang's duel for China.